Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of shattering glass echoing down your street. Not just one window, but dozens, hundreds. The sound rolling like thunder made of knives. Smoke drifts across rooftops. A red glow flickers against the horizon. And beneath it all, screams, the kind that tell you something irreversible is happening. This was Germany, November 9th, 1938. The world would later call it Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. But in the moment, it was more than broken shop windows. It was a signal to millions of Jews in Germany and Austria that their lives had crossed a threshold from persecution into open violence. To understand how it came to this, you need to step back into the tense autumn of 1938. For years, Jews had been stripped of their rights piece by piece, banned from public service, forced out of professions, expelled from schools, their businesses marked with humiliating signs. The propaganda machine worked day and night, painting them as parasites, traitors, enemies of the people. Ordinary Germans were taught to look away, or worse, to join in. Still, violence on such a scale did not erupt out of nowhere. The spark came from Paris in early November. A 17-year-old Jewish teenager named Herschel Grynszpan had learned that his family, along with thousands of other Polish Jews, had been brutally expelled from Germany and left stranded at the border. Desperate, angry, and alone, he walked into the German embassy in Paris and fired 5 shots at a diplomat, Ernst vom Rath. The diplomat died 2 days later. Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda chief, seized the moment. His speech at a Nazi gathering on November 9th turned vom Rath's death into a pretext for revenge. He didn't issue direct orders in writing. He didn't need to. His words were enough. That night, the storm began. Across Germany and Austria, brown shirt mobs, SS units, and ordinary citizens spilled into the streets with hammers, clubs, and torches. Synagogues, some centuries old, were set ablaze. Jewish-owned shops were smashed open, merchandise looted, glass crunching under boots. Men were dragged from their homes in their nightclothes, beaten in front of their families, or hauled into trucks with no explanation. Police were ordered not to intervene. Fire brigades stood by as flames consumed holy places, stepping in only to ensure nearby Aryan buildings did not burn. Neighbors watched from their windows. Some cheered. Some pretended not to see. A few whispered prayers behind locked doors. And in that atmosphere of fear and fire, Jewish families realized the unthinkable. This was no longer about laws or propaganda. It was about survival. What happened that night was only the beginning. In the next parts, you'll see how it unfolded hour by hour, street by street, family by family. The first flames rose just before midnight. They started quietly, with the sound of splintering wood. But within minutes, entire neighborhoods glowed red against the black November sky. Across Germany and Austria, from Berlin to Leipzig, from Munich to Vienna, synagogues that had stood for centuries went up in flames almost simultaneously. The mobs were prepared. Doors were smashed with axes and rifle butts. Glass chandeliers fell onto marble floors and shattered like ice. Pews were torn apart, prayer books ripped from shelves, thrown into piles, and set ablaze. Fire raced up the walls of sanctuaries that had once been the spiritual heart of Jewish communities. Within minutes, roofs collapsed, spilling sparks into the cold night air. And the fire brigades? They were there. But their orders were not to extinguish the flames. They stood and watched, hoses ready only to protect the surrounding Aryan buildings from catching fire. The synagogues were left to burn to the ground. In Leipzig, witnesses later recalled the synagogue as a giant torch. flames licking into the sky while crowds gathered to watch. In Frankfurt, centuries-old scrolls, the sacred Torahs, were carried into the street and doused with kerosene. They curled and blackened as men laughed, tossing cigarette butts into the pile. In Vienna, sacred relics and prayer shawls were thrown out of windows. Children picked them up from the street, mocking the words embroidered on them, before stomping them into the mud. The destruction wasn't confined to synagogues. It spread to Jewish-owned shops, businesses, schools, and homes. Windows shattered under iron bars and boots, showering glass onto sidewalks. The sound was so constant that survivors later described it as a storm of breaking glass, relentless, deafening, almost mechanical in its rhythm. This was the sound that gave the night its name, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. But for those who lived through it, it felt less like crystal and more like bones being crushed underfoot. Shops that had been carefully built over generations, tailors' shops, bookstores, bakeries, small clothing boutiques, were gutted in hours. Mannequins lay decapitated in the street, covered in shards. Cash registers were ripped open. Merchandise was looted by the very neighbors who had once smiled politely to the shopkeepers during the day. The violence was not limited to property. Jewish men and women were pulled out of their homes, beaten with clubs and fists, some dragged half-dressed into the cold November air. In Munich, a young boy later described seeing his father forced into the street in only his underwear, blood pouring from his mouth while men jeered. In Berlin, women were slapped, their hair cut off in public, while their children cried helplessly at their feet. One survivor recalled recognizing familiar faces among the attackers. "I saw the shoemaker from the next street. I saw the man who sold me milk every morning. They were there laughing, spitting on us." This betrayal, the sight of ordinary citizens joining the violence, was one of the cruelest wounds of the night. Throughout the chaos, the police were present. Their role was not to stop the violence, but to ensure that it unfolded in a controlled way. Many officers pointed mobs toward Jewish-owned businesses, keeping lists in their hands to make sure no target was missed. When desperate neighbors tried to intervene, the police threatened to arrest them too. By dawn, the destruction was staggering. More than 1,000 synagogues lay in ruins, reduced to ash or gutted shells. Over 7,000 businesses were vandalized or destroyed. Streets were littered with broken glass, burned books, twisted metal, and bloodstains. Smoke hung low in the air, choking those who walked through it. But this was only the surface. Beneath the debris was terror, a message delivered with fire and fists. Jews no longer had safety in Germany or Austria. They were not citizens. They were not neighbors. They were prey, and the night was far from over. As the fires still smoldered, the next wave began. Systematic arrests. Orders went out across the country. Police and SS units were to round up Jewish men, regardless of age or status, and deliver them to prisons or directly into concentration camps. Around 30,000 men would be seized in the days that followed. For many families, the sound of glass breaking gave way to the knock on the door. The moment they lost fathers, brothers, sons. The night of broken glass was not just an eruption of hatred. It was a rehearsal, a signal, a public demonstration that the regime was ready to move from humiliation and exclusion to open violence. And the world had only begun to understand what that meant. Before we continue, stop for a moment. Ask yourself, if you had been standing on one of those streets, would you have turned away? Would you have spoken out? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe this story must be told again and again so it's never forgotten, hit like and subscribe. When dawn broke on November 10th, 1938, The streets of Germany and Austria looked like a war zone. Smoke still rose from the shells of burned synagogues. Sidewalks glittered with shards of glass. Shop signs that once carried proud family names hung twisted, charred, or gone entirely. But the worst was yet to come, not in the ruins themselves, but in what happened to the people. Across the Reich, police and SS units began systematic arrests. Orders were simple. Jewish men between 16 and 60 were to be taken. By the end of that day, around 30,000 Jews had been forced into trucks, train cars, and holding cells. Most had committed no crime. Their only offense was being Jewish. Families watched in horror as fathers, brothers, and grandfathers were dragged from their homes. In Berlin, entire apartment blocks echoed with the pounding of boots in stairwells, the crying of children clinging to their fathers, the sharp orders shouted by uniformed men. In Vienna, men were forced into the street barefoot, hands over their heads, surrounded by laughing crowds. One Jewish woman later described how her husband was beaten with rifle butts in front of their children. "My son tried to run to him, but a soldier held him back. He was 8 years old. He cried until he fainted." The husband never came home. He was deported to Dachau. Concentration camps, already brutal places, swelled with new prisoners overnight. In Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen, thousands arrived at once. They were shoved through gates marked Arbeit macht frei and immediately beaten, shaved, and stripped of dignity. Many were crammed into overcrowded barracks, with no food and barely enough air to breathe. Guards took pleasure in the chaos, forcing new arrivals to stand for hours in freezing weather or to run in circles until they collapsed. Some prisoners never survived the first week. Meanwhile, women and children were left behind, shattered by the sudden disappearance of their loved ones. With homes destroyed and businesses gone, many had nowhere to go. Those who tried to seek help often found doors closed. Some German neighbors who once exchanged greetings on the street now crossed to the other side, pretending not to know them. Others openly mocked them, spitting insults as they passed. And yet, even in this hell, there were moments that revealed the human soul, both cruel and kind. A few brave neighbors quietly slipped bread to families whose shops had been destroyed. A school teacher in Munich hid a Torah scroll in her attic, refusing to let it burn. But for every act of courage, there were 10 acts of betrayal. Bank clerks froze Jewish accounts overnight. Insurance companies refused to pay out for the wrecked businesses. The state made it clear, Jews would not be compensated for their losses. Instead, they would be fined for the damage done to them, forced to pay for the destruction of their own lives. The emotional toll was immeasurable. Survivors recalled the silence of children who had once laughed freely, now staring blankly at broken walls. Old men sat in chairs, unmoving, as if their spirits had left them while their bodies remained. The sense of despair was thick, pressing down like the smoke that lingered over the cities. What made Kristallnacht so terrifying was not just the violence itself, but the participation or the silence of ordinary people. Some had joined the mobs with joy, smashing windows and looting. Others stood by with folded arms, watching neighbors be dragged away, saying nothing. And in that silence, the victims understood. They were truly alone. The night of broken glass was not a random riot. It was organized terror. It showed Jews that there was no longer a safe corner, no longer a distinction between law and mob. It revealed to the world, for those willing to see, that Germany had crossed into something darker. By the end of that day, Jewish communities across the Reich were broken, not only physically, but psychologically. They knew now that the rules had changed forever. Survival would no longer mean keeping quiet or hoping for justice. It would mean enduring the unendurable. And yet, as terrible as that November night was, it was only the beginning. The machinery of destruction was just starting to turn. When the sun rose on November 10, 1938, the light revealed a country transformed. Streets across Germany and Austria shimmered with broken glass, glittering like ice under the pale morning sky. But there was no beauty in the sight. The glass came from thousands of shattered windows, the ruins of Jewish businesses, schools, and homes. Burnt wood and the acrid stench of smoke hung heavy in the air. Entire neighborhoods looked like they had been bombed. Synagogues, once landmarks of faith and tradition, stood as hollow skeletons. Some still smoldered, their charred walls leaking black trails of soot. Others were reduced to rubble, their stones scattered in the streets like the bones of a body torn apart. Torah scrolls and prayer books lay trampled in the gutters, their pages torn, wet with rain and ash. For ordinary Germans walking to work that morning, the destruction was impossible to miss. Shop signs that once bore familiar Jewish names had been ripped down, storefronts gutted. Clothing hung from broken mannequins. Children on their way to school kicked shards of glass like pebbles. Many laughed, others looked away. Silence wrapped the streets as tightly as the smoke. Inside Jewish homes, the silence was heavier still. Families sat in shock, staring at the wreckage of their lives. Tables overturned, photographs smashed, cupboards emptied. Fathers were missing, dragged away in the night, taken to prisons and camps. Mothers clutched children who had not slept, their eyes wide, their voices gone. No one knew when, or if, the men would return. The regime's reaction added another layer of cruelty. Instead of punishing the perpetrators, Nazi authorities blamed the victims. Insurance companies refused to pay for damages to Jewish property. Banks froze Jewish accounts. To add insult to injury, the government imposed a massive atonement fine on the Jewish community itself, over 1 billion Reichsmarks, to cover the costs of the destruction. The victims were forced to pay for the crimes committed against them. International reaction came quickly, but weakly. Newspapers around the world carried headlines about the night of broken glass. Photographs of burned synagogues and shattered shops shocked public opinion. Protests erupted in Paris, London, New York, and other cities. Diplomats sent formal condemnations. Yet no real action followed. Borders remained largely closed. Immigration quotas stayed low. For the Jews of Germany, there was no escape. The world was watching, but the world did not intervene. Within Germany, reactions varied. Some citizens whispered in private that the violence had gone too far, that it was shameful. Others justified it, claiming it was a response to the killing of a German diplomat. Many simply shrugged and carried on with their lives, stepping over the glass as if it were nothing more than yesterday's rain. The majority chose silence, and silence became complicity. For the Jewish community, the message was undeniable. Kristallnacht was not a riot. It was not an accident. It was a state-sponsored warning. There was no longer any security, no longer any protection, no longer any future in Germany. The choice was exile, nearly impossible, or annihilation. In one diary entry, a Jewish man in Berlin wrote, "Last night we still thought of ourselves as Germans. This morning we know we are only Jews, and for that alone, we are hunted." The morning after Kristallnacht was not the end of terror. It was the beginning of something far worse. The world did not yet know the scale of what was coming. But for those who swept the glass from their floors, buried their burned prayer books, and waited for the knock on the door, it was clear. The future had shattered with the windows. Kristallnacht marked a threshold. Until that November night, many Jews in Germany still clung to the hope that things might improve, that persecution, however brutal, would stop short of total destruction. But the night of broken glass shattered that illusion forever. The statistics alone reveal its scale. More than 1,000 synagogues burned, over 7,000 Jewish-owned businesses destroyed, hundreds killed or driven to suicide, and 30,000 Jewish men arrested and sent to concentration camps. But behind every number was a family torn apart, a community erased, a life changed forever. The Nazi regime moved swiftly to turn the chaos into policy. Within days, new laws tightened the noose around Jewish existence. Jews were banned from owning businesses, forced to sell what remained for a fraction of its value. They were expelled from schools, forbidden from attending theaters, concerts, or even public parks. Their identification cards were stamped with a red J, and their passports invalidated unless marked the same. The regime stripped away every right, every protection, every shred of dignity. Insurance claims were seized by the state, ensuring that Jewish families would receive nothing for their losses. Instead, they were forced to pay the infamous atonement fine, a staggering 1 billion Reichsmarks, an impossible sum designed to break them completely. In effect, the victims were punished for their own persecution. For the Jewish community, Kristallnacht was a moment of revelation. It showed them, with fire and broken glass, that there was no safety left in the Reich. Escape became the desperate goal, but opportunities were scarce. Many countries closed their borders or imposed strict quotas. Ships carrying Jewish refugees were turned away. Even as the world expressed outrage, very few offered sanctuary. In hindsight, Kristallnacht was the rehearsal for genocide. It was the moment when hatred became state policy of open violence, when neighbors became enemies, when silence became complicity. The pogrom was not only tolerated, it was orchestrated, encouraged, and celebrated by the Nazi regime. And the world, though horrified, failed to stop it. Survivors remembered the silence afterward more than the noise of the destruction. One woman from Hamburg recalled walking through the streets the next morning. There was glass everywhere, the smell of smoke, and people going about their business as if nothing had happened. That silence was the loudest thing I had ever heard. The night of broken glass was not just an act of terror. It was a warning. It showed the path that would lead to ghettos, deportations, and the gas chambers of Auschwitz and Treblinka. A path that began not with war, but with neighbors smashing windows, lighting fires, and choosing silence over humanity. Today, Kristallnacht remains one of history's darkest reminders of how quickly a society can descend into barbarism when hatred is left unchecked. The glass that littered the streets in 1938 has long since been swept away. But the lesson remains sharp. When injustice is ignored, it spreads. When voices are silent, violence speaks louder. The Jews of Germany understood on that night that their world had ended. For us, remembering it means refusing to let history repeat itself. The point of no return is always closer than it seems, and it is our choice whether we recognize it before it's too late.